Okay, well, we're a couple minutes past 9:30 and we've still got people rolling in. So I'm just going to start with some greetings and a couple of announcements before we get to our main event. Thanks for being here. It's a busy time of year for a lot of people, and some people are already dispersing for some holiday travels, but many of us are still here. And thank you for being here today to our HIV Center Grand Rounds. And we're very fortunate to have two of our postdoctoral fellows visiting with us today. So we're very excited about that. Let me just give you the announcement of our first Grand Rounds in the new year on January 6th. It's another double billing. We have Raymond Moody talking about the role of emotion regulation in maintaining syndemic burden among sexual minority men, along with Michael Vaughn presenting on 3 Gay Generations, the ongoing impact of HIV/AIDS on meaning-making processes. So that will be our first rounds in the new year on January 6th. We hope to see you then. So let me move on, unless anyone here on the panel or anyone wants to make any other announcement. Okay, so we have a double billing today. I'm going to introduce both of them, and we will have some time in between for questions, and then hopefully some discussion at the end for the overall. So we have with us today Rita Melendez, who is a professor and senior research scientist at the Center for Research and Education on Gender and Sexuality at San Francisco State University. Rita received her Ph.D. in sociology from Yale University in 2000. In 2002, she got a master's degree in biostatistics here at Melendez School of Public Health, Columbia University, where at that time she was a postdoctoral research fellow at the HIV Center for Clinical Behavioral Studies. Rita is the recipient of a National Research Service Award Research Training Fellowship, and she was mentored by our own Dr. Anke Ehrhardt. At the time, she specializes in combined quantitative and qualitative methods in researching HIV issues as they relate to minority women and Latino immigrants in the US. Dr. Melendez is currently working on research relating to the health and healthcare of Latino immigrants in the US. Her research has been published widely, such as American Journal of Public Health, Culture, Health, and Sexuality, Women Health, AIDS and Behavior. I could go on, but I won't. And then we also have David Knapp Whittier with us. He is a research behavioral scientist on the HIV prevention science team, HIV capacity development branch. You're right, David, that's a mouthful, at the Division of HIV Prevention at the Centers for Disease Control, which we know is very important these days and has great influence on everything we do. There he has led development and implementation of numerous HIV prevention, intervention, and public health strategy toolkits and trainings. David received his PhD in sociology at Stony Brook University. In addition to our HIV Center fellowship, he also received postdoctoral training from the Ford Foundation. Over the past 35 years, I can't believe it's been that long, David has worked in HIV prevention in community-based organizations, public health agencies, and universities, with the past 16 years being at the CDC. His current major subject matter responsibilities are HIV PrEP, HIV status neutral navigation, and re-engagement in care. So I'm going to turn it over to the speakers, and as usual, Stephen Sukumaran will be monitoring our Q&A and our discussion. Feel free to put questions in the chat, but also at the time for discussion, you can unmute yourself and ask your questions live, but keep yourself muted during the presentations. So thanks for being here, Rita and David, and over to both of you.
David, it's okay if I go. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Bob. Thanks for your introduction, and thank you to Teo and to Stephen for organizing all this. It's really nice to be back in the virtual way to see David, to present with him. You know, the last grand rounds to see Mario and Brian. You know, I look forward to seeing the other fellows as we present and go through grand rounds. So coming back has actually, stirred a whole lot of memories. And I put a thing in photo of self with David and fellows because we were trying to find photos of ourselves in 2000, early 2000s. It was really hard to find, but it does kind of get me thinking about my time at the HIV Center. I was a postdoc there from 2000, I think just end of 2003, the beginning of 2004, before I came to my current position at San Francisco State University, where I've in sexuality studies. I'm also in sociology. I'm a sociologist like David. When I at the HIV Center, really, I was focused on this idea of kind of seeing gender as a system of power and how gender could create or destruct health in many ways. And I was so fortunate to be able to work on Project Field with Susie Hoffman, Teresa Exner, and Anka Earhart, where really it's taking this idea of how do you apply feminine theory and how do you apply it to make it constructive, to create somewhere women can take care of themselves and protect themselves. And in working on issues of gender empowerment, I came to see the importance of structural factors and how, a lot of there's a system in place, but you have, something like knowledge around condom use or the ability to use a female condom that can change things dramatically, even if there's a foundation of inequality. As I came to San Francisco State University, I really kind of started to focus a little bit more on those structural factors, look a little bit more in terms of race and ethnicity, and how race and ethnicity, impact systems of care, especially access to care, prevention, and well-being. One thing that I really brought with me from the HIV Center that I learned a lot about as a postdoc was community-based participation action research. And really, I was very fortunate to be able to do that when I was at San Francisco State and continue to do that. But today I want to talk about recruitment. And we all know recruitment is central to each and every research study that we ever do, making sure that we have participants, also making sure that we have the right participants, that the participants we need to have for this study, particular research question. There's a lot of pain and challenges that go along with recruiting. I think you could ask any of my graduate students who are doing study that recruitment is really often the crux and the most challenging part of a research study. But I think recruitment brings up other issues, and that is the relationship between the communities need services and research communities. How research is seen by communities of color and their willingness to participate in research studies. And I think what we always remember is all studies skewed towards a group of people who are willing to participate in that study. So I think it's to think about recruitment, to think about widening the stance of who wants to participate in a research study in order to create better research, to really create research that reaches the people who most need it. I think I'm going to take it a little bit step further and say that recruitment is also contextualized by the economic realities that we're seeing right now. And also sportsmanship, who funds what, as well as community-based organizations and researchers. So when we talk about recruitment, and you look at some of the papers that have been written around that, it's really nice to see that they bring up some of these large issues around social structure and contextual issues around recruitment, and thinking back to historical issues and economic issues, and there's kind of this element of there's distrust in among communities of color in the research community, or there's lack of access to technology. So sometimes some of these big issues get kind of condensed and the focus becomes back to the community of color, to the communities that need to be recruited, but are often not recruited. With Latinos, something additional that they're often treated as a group. And I know everybody here's heard this times, but it cannot be emphasized. And again, that really there's so much diversity among Latino populations that it's almost nonsensical to think of Latinos as one group. Really, and in thinking of success in terms of recruiting Latinos can be kind of detrimental. Looking for a specific group of Latinos, it doesn't you, you don't want to just focus on whether some identifies as having a Hispanic background or not. You want to look at some other issues that might make being Latino more important. For example, immigration status. If you are undocumented versus documented, it can have a huge impact in terms of your active care. It can have a huge impact in terms of your ability to advocate for self. Language, being bilingual, Spanish versus bilingual, or primarily English speakers. Number of years in the US, of origin, and other languages spoken. So sometimes we kind of, oh, Spanish, Portuguese are the only languages that we really need to think about. But there's a number of indigenous languages that many immigrants in the US speak, and is their second language. So those are important things to kind of think about when thinking about success with regard to recruitment. In my own time at San Francisco State University, I've been really fortunate to be able to work on a number of research studies that look at different Latino populations around the Bay Area in California. So we did a kind of when in my years at San Francisco State, where we explored access to care HIV positive immigrants. So these were Latino immigrants who were HIV positive, and we interviewed them baseline and then 9 to 12 months out. And we did another study where we were exploring issues of sexual identity disclosure. So we wanted to have Spanish-speaking immigrants who were aware and were able to say that they were gay, homosexual, bisexual, but hadn't disclosed that to their family or to close family. And just recently, we finished up a study. We were exploring issues of care for homeless Spanish-speaking individuals. So really diving into recruiting homeless Spanish speakers was something new and very challenging. And currently, we're looking at issues of Narcan access for Spanish-speaking drug users, and see is knowledge and access to Narcan available among Spanish-speaking immigrants in the Bay Area. Originally, and I skipped over, we did a study of access to PrEP among speaking immigrants in rural California. So that was all over the state. So each one really brought a lot of challenges, but each one rooted in this idea of a need for services, a need to really either expand access or provide services or come up with some sort of ability for increased access to services. And each of our strategies had to vary a lot. And just like every other state, it was always a challenge. And one thing that we did is we adjusted. We often saw what the problem was and we would change things. For our first study, when we ended up recruiting quite a number of undocumented immigrants who are HIV positive, we noticed that when we described as being from San Francisco State University, we would translate that to Spanish, the term estado, that term state could be problematic. So we had to kind of adjust. For homeless individuals, it often very different for Spanish-speaking immigrants who are homeless. It meant going to different places, finding different locations, finding people who were working, who just didn't have a home, who were finding different places to sleep, either in offices or people's couches. It also meant like not really approaching strongly, like actually just being present was more important than going up to people and asking for their participation. Asking for names was problematic. And doing things like providing talks or resources was really so important in recruiting this individuals. So one of the things that I take away from the research studies that we've done in the past is this connection between services and recruitment, and having this line that through the study at all ends, from the motivation to the study, through the study to the end result of the study, that really focuses on services and expanding services for Spanish immigrants. And really, I get a chance to talk a little bit about my research partner, Jorge Cepeda, who I've been working with for, it's hard to believe, but 15 years. And he is really instrumental in every study. And I think of him as an equal partner in every study, from every aspect of it. And he has been at the San Francisco AIDS Foundation since 1992, when he started by volunteering to speak Spanish for their AIDS hotline. And I think one thing that I remember learning about when I first learned about CBPR was this idea of sort of like researchers bring their research knowledge and community partners bring their community knowledge. And a lot of times what happens is there's an inequality in there, right? Because researchers are the ones who receive the grants, they're the ones who kind of instigate the proposal. And then what happens is often those community partners get bracketed into recruitment. And what I like about the partnership that I've had with Jorge and with the San Francisco AIDS Foundation is that it's been a lot equal than I think the usual model. So we bring it together in terms of the innovation, the study, the proposal, all the way through to the analysis of the study. And I think one thing that holds true throughout the recruitment process is that we're recruiting for both participants, but also folding in new clients into the AIDS Foundation and being able to expand service to a new set of clients that may have been there at first. Really kind of drive home a little bit more. The end goal of the study is something that's useful to the people we're recruiting. So it's something that's really easy to talk about. It's easy for them to understand. It's just goes together with some of their needs, and you're able to recruit in a much more easy fashion. It's a study conducted by Latinos who are bilingual and cultural, and for Latinos, Spanish speaker. And so I think there's an importance in there in sort of having every aspect of the study that is conducted by Latinos. And I think that aspect of bicultural is really important. It's one that Jorge taught me. As we often talk about just bilingual, sort of the ability to speak Spanish. And often that's just cut it enough with recruiting participants. Really want to have bicultural. And again, it goes back to that being specific with regard to who you're recruiting in Latino communities. It's not just Latinos as this large group, it's a specific group. Do you have knowledge of homelessness among Spanish-speaking immigrants? Do you have knowledge of drug use? Do you have knowledge of HIV services? And able to really speak to people in a manner that they are able to relate to. But also, am I safe? That's a question for Spanish-speaking communities, especially with the political differences and the anti-immigrant hate that have been going on. The question of safety is really important, and speaking to people who understand what it means to be undocumented, what it means to have an immigration status or to have immigration be important. Safety with regard to illegal activities or drug use, all those things are really kind of crucial in terms of the recruitment process. And I just kind of want to on my sociologist hat a little bit and kind of take a step back and sort of say, we're really in a very difficult times with regard to economic system. I think of it kind of as if you're playing Monopoly and you're kind of towards the end of the game when it's not fun anymore, and there's a lot of people that have accumulated a lot of wealth. If you haven't gone in that early part, you're sort of suffering through kind of each round, each time that dice gets hit. And it's just a really difficult time. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. And I think as researchers, we often see ourselves as separate economic systems or trying to assist what is going on in the economic inequalities. But really, as far as participants see us, they kind of see us as part of more the people who are in that more successful group. And I think it's important to keep that in mind and to really think about what are some ways to provide power back for participants to make them feel that they're a part of the research versus being researched upon. And I think one thing that was really important in terms of the study we with homeless populations is just like they often didn't want to give their name. Like it was just like, I'm not giving you my name. And it was important to recognize that and then to make changes to not ask for names. But that is really an element of sort of being able to retain a sense of power, to retain a sense of, I have this that you want. And you know what? It's mine to give when I want to give it to you. I think going on to some of the benefits for recruiting for both services and research, for community organizations, I think you have the ability to recruit for more populations that maybe don't know your organization or maybe don't think that they want to come in. If they have a friendly face, they have something that they can talk to, they might be more willing to come in and seek some of those services. For researchers, is that targeted recruitment of really reaching out to those individuals who need it and not just checking off a box of like, well, I've reached my number of Latinos, so now I can kind of give up. But are those Latinos the ones that you really want in terms of research setting, in terms of your question? And I think that there's also, there has to be a real commitment on the researchers to work with community organizations and to give up their sort of sense of running the show and of being able to be a part of the show. I think that in order to really make changes to recruitment and to able to kind of provide more services for communities, there have to be some changes that happen. I think that really universities like mine, San Francisco State University, I consider us a majority minority university. That's how I think of us. It's a term that often gets where most of our students are individuals of color. There's a lot of a good number of faculty who are people of color. And the purpose of these universities have been set up to really and provide education to kind of a large scale. But there's a real opportunity there for universities like mine to research. And there was like a market study that they did of San Francisco State University where they went out in the Bay Area and sort of asked people about their knowledge of San Francisco State. And it was amazing that the very high percentage, well over half of the individuals knew of San Francisco State either because they went there or they knew somebody close who went there, someone in their family or a close friend who went there. So the outreach of universities like majority minority universities is there. There's a lot of buy-in to the university. There's a lot of respect. And I have to say, when I go out and I talk, when I say, oh, I'm from San Francisco State University, there's always a smile on my face. It's always like, oh yeah, I know it. Like I like it. And I think that that's a really invaluable part of research that really you can't, there's no substitution for that. And I think people in communities want to work with institutions like San Francisco State. And I think people want to participate in studies and do things with San Francisco State. But that requires on the part of the university consistently supporting research, consistently supporting faculty. I think benefits faculty, but it benefits students. Unfortunately, at my time at San Francisco State, it's been so inconsistent depending on state budget systems or depending on administration services. And I think you really need a consistent commitment to research in order to bring in more faculty of color to research who want to work with community-based organizations, who want to work with communities of color. And I think there also need to be changes on the granting level in terms of more NIH federal funding, because a lot of times I that federal funding a little bit of a thing when you do not come from an RO institution, right? And a lot of times institutions like San Francisco State have problems with resources and facilities. It's not something that we can just sort of check off and say, yeah, we've got that, because it doesn't always easily. But I think giving that ding to institutions that are majority minority is really a disservice to communities. And I think if there's consistent help there for those, facilities and resources, there will be more built up, right? Because part of the reason why the universities are able to consistently support research because they do not have the funding in place. So if there was funding in place, I think it could provide more consistent research facilities for everybody. And I also think that there could be changes made to how funding always goes to PhDs or individuals with degrees, as I think called. I think it's great to bring CBOs and individuals who have devoted their lives working with communities to come into the fold and to be equal partners in terms of getting the grants and getting the funds. And I think if that were possible, it would equalize some of those research partnerships. And I think a part of that goes back to this idea of being bicultural, having studies that really top down are able to really speak to participants that they're trying to recruit. So just some final thoughts. I think I've maybe gone over my, I just want to say recruitment is sort of the tip of the iceberg in terms of social issues. I think a lot of those things are under the water, things we don't see, an opportunity to sort of see them and to be able to make changes. And some of the changes are bigger than others, but a lot of them just require knowledge around, who we are and who we want to recruit for the studies. So I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rita. As a reminder to everyone, if you have a question for Rita about her presentation, you could enter your question in the chat, or you can use the raise hand feature and I'll unmute you. Teo, go ahead.
Thank you. It is as if you're still in the training program and in the HIV Center, because all the things you're talking about in a way they should be continuous points of attention, of course, but they are all really very heavily discussed. And it's nice how you brought all these different issues together and really focused on recruitment and relationships with participants. You mentioned something about a study with Latino homeless people in San Francisco. Can you say something more about that and how the recruitment went there and how you did that?
Yeah, we actually started and finished that study just before COVID. We were in the sense that we were able to go out and go to places. What we wanted to do is actually map homeless population in San Francisco using GIS, and it actually brought up a lot of questions, right? Because if you start mapping, and this GIS data is sort of often publicly available, people can search it and find it, and other people can it. The problem is you don't know who's using it and why. So it became kind of an ethical question of like, should we do this mapping where we'll basically be highlighting where Spanish-speaking homeless individuals are located in, in San Francisco. It's different from where there were non-Spanish speaking homeless individuals. And we didn't want to, because the political situation is becoming so volatile that we want to put that out. We didn't even want to have the data in order to protect the participants that we were recruiting. The recruitment was a total learning process. So kind of going in and naively and saying, we're doing a study. We want to know, what some of the needs are that you would have, and talk to you about speaking services. And there was just a lot of resistance, and there's a lot of protection that goes on there. And so really learning to just kind of like be present and let people come and approach you versus approach them, and not being kind of like recruitment attitude with regard to the homeless population was really important.
Thank you.
We have a couple of comments from Stephanie Hubbard. Stephanie says, "Thank you so much, Rita. That was great and very helpful presentation. I feel like we have a lot to learn from this experience in the research world and apply it to recruitment for clients and service provision."
Well, thanks, Stephanie. It's your name.
Any other questions? If not, David, I'll turn it to you. Floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thanks. I am going to start my video just for a minute, but I'm not going to leave it on for long. And I want to start my screen up here. And thank you, Rita. That was really interesting. And thanks for the sociology. And I'd like to talk to you more about recruitment and a lot of the issues you are bringing up are really interesting, and things I've given a lot of thought to across my life. I often tell people who are doing recruitment or doing field work that, the people they're trying to recruit or work with are not on their time, they're on their own time. And field work could be a lot of standing around and trying to develop a relationship and rapport and get along and get in. And if you take the opinion that they're somehow on your time, you're not going to be very successful. So there's a lot more social interactions and elements to the relationship and to what's going on there than just simply, getting a customer for a product or something. Anyway, thanks again. Good morning, I'm David, and the title of my talk is More Than a Pill, the Field of HIV Prevention in the U.S. And opinions expressed here are mine and mine alone, and I want to turn off my video. Okay, hopefully you can see you're able to see my screen.
Not yet, David.
Not yet? Okay, so let's see. Share the screen. Now let me put it on my slideshow. How about now?
Yep, looks great.
Okay, great. So I feel a little bit out of place speaking about my post-HIV Center fellowship work, and that's because I really haven't been an independent investigator. At the CDC, people work on teams on everything pretty much, although some people lead them, but they're usually working on a COAG, a grant with others doing research often, or they're doing epidemiology and working with data sets, but on big teams. Anyway, I want to try to illustrate my talk today, the idea of the field of HIV prevention in the US as a field of social action for analysis, a missing unit of analysis really in HIV prevention. And I want to draw on concepts, what I've been doing for concepts to illustrate HIV as a social action field and a field of social action. And so I'm not just eliminating a PrEP. I worked on DEBI from the outset from 2004 going forward, and DEBI still has some traction. So I still kind of support DEBI. So I want to draw on that too. You know, I think that this focus on social fields and social actions may afford more than implementation science does now, looking at singular cluster implementations. I want to build on concepts of structural interventions and implementation science that are finally coming to the fore in the field. And I think that's really important developments. And Rita was talking about the importance of social structure a little bit ago. And I think we've kind of neglected it and not used the sociology and other social science that's out there. We may not be appreciating as much as needed about social structure, about interacting systems and levels of sociocultural phenomena that are needed to support pro-health action, social action, and to prevent HIV in the United States. And please forgive me if I come across as preachy or teachy, kind of lecture. I teach a lot in my job. And also, this is pretty high level. There's a lot about what is knowledge and how do we know, or ontology and epistemology that lays behind what I'm going to be talking about, that I'm really not going to get into the detail of those sociology of science and other things. Here's my roadmap for the presentation. So first, I'm going to walk through what I've been doing since I left the HIV Center, which was the request for this talk. And I'm going to point to concepts and needs for analysis at the level of the field of HIV prevention. So again, I'm going to illustrate this drawing from things I've been working on since leaving the HIV Center. So namely, mostly PrEP lately and the DEBI project. And then I'm going to sum up with the need for critical analysis in the field of HIV prevention, looking at the field as a strategic action field and as a unit of analysis. This is just a section heading, so I'm going to skip over that and go to this. My interest in activities took on a new focus with the advent of AIDS in the early 1980s or late 70s, actually. I volunteered and worked in communities, CBOs, health departments, and healthcare systems and universities, doing research and evaluation, policy and planning, and capacity building ever since the advent of AIDS. AIDS devastated my friendship networks as it was in 1980. Just about everybody I knew. I worked in gay bars at the time and supporting myself going through college, and most everyone I know died. My life experience prior to the epidemic already led me to an interest in social problems and social change, as I would describe it today, back then, and we probably would call it social justice today. I've always sought to bring sociology to bear in HIV prevention by applying my knowledge of it in projects and products I've worked on, translating sociological theory, knowledge, and methods to practical strategies for everyday HIV prevention. So at the HIV Center in 2001 to 2002, I was just there for a year. I experienced 9/11, and I can recall Rita and I walking through Central Park with nary a plane overhead for days on end, except for military jets roaring overhead. And that was quite a time. And I still think about the people who were there and who we lost, and that whole experience. It was really incredible. And I taught at the Borough of Manhattan Community College sociology at the time, and many of my students were there at 9/11 in the morning. And I tell you, that was one of the best sociology classes I had, because unfortunately 9/11 really brought the social interrelief, and my students all of a sudden had a sociological imagination they didn't have before 9/11. That was anyway, it was a really interesting time, an important time. I also worked on a CBO training program that we were running at the HIV Center, where we were working with people who worked in CBOs across the United States to help them with their research projects and formative evaluation and evaluation studies and so on. I developed some papers based on that project and others for publication at that time. And also, finally, I developed a pilot grant proposal and cleared it through the Columbia IRB for a community-based participatory critical ethnography of the sexual lives of men who have sex with men of color in the context of HIV threat in a non-metropolitan area of the Southeast United States. And I was really proud of that proposal, and I would have really loved to do that project. I'd spent a lot of time on critical ethnography of sexual behavior of gay men and so on, in addition to my HIV work since the early 80s, prior to coming to this HIV Center. Since the HIV Center at the CDC, I first went there to do rapid ethnographic assessments of syphilis outbreaks, which is really interesting work. And I think that, when they really get to outbreak response, or that in terms of genetic transmission and so on, that, when the rubber really is going to hit the road with recruitment and with meeting people in places, that ethnographic assessments is really, a lot of data analysis going on now about molecular clusters and so on. And some of the work is getting done in communities responding to outbreaks. But, I hope before I retire, which will be soon, I'm planning soon in 3 years to retire, I might be able to get back into some field work like that. I worked on the Diffusion of Innovation, DEBI project since its onset in 2014. And since the advent of PrEP, I've been working to support PrEP. So the last 20 years, I've worked on providing technical assistance to programs funded to do HIV prevention, to international, to agency internal staff, and to grant cooperative agreement recipients that we fund in our branch to provide training and technical assistance to services, to programs across the U.S. An everyday effort that means a lot of providing subject matter expertise on specific strategies and interventions, developing and deploying intervention technical support resources like intervention how-to kits and trainings, and supporting some research projects in other departments, and presenting information on HIV prevention variously to the U.S. workforce. I find a lot of people don't know what capacity building is, and here's a quick definition. I'm not going to read it, but I put it up there. And actually, capacity building means a lot, and it means working with civil society and other things. And I'm just not going to. People are just unfamiliar with it, I think, and I think it's an important part of implementation. And I'll talk about that a little bit later and point to how I think that it helps. So now I want to raise this concept of the field of HIV prevention. In my mind's eye, with this word cloud, this is actually a word cloud drawn from using terms about social action fields and social fields analysis and social fields theory and sociology. In my mind's eye sees in this really a system of interaction among people within social boundaries and within a social framework of institutions, roles, rules, and culture of values, symbols, and ideologies, including gender, race, science, and beliefs that shape and rationalize the organization of rules of society, including that of science. And these systems control, allocate, withhold, and distribute resources. They're key to access, availability, and acceptability of HIV prevention resources. These systems are an ongoing result of human actions. What do we know about regularized social action? Who, what, when, where, and how do they work to structure social life, including HIV prevention? Strategic action fields can help us recognize and analyze social processes that overarch particular implementation context. This is just to give a physicality to the image of the field of HIV prevention, and it's just very quantitative and just sort of points to the size of the workforce. So I'm really more interested in qualitative aspects of the field, but as far as I know, no one has enumerated the HIV prevention workforce, much less detailed the range and types of workers that make it up, except for, say, in clinical treatment, and I would say especially in Ryan White funding and at the level of that jurisdictional funding, although nationally I think they do have a fairly good compass on the size of the workforce and the nature of the workers. I want to acknowledge that the workforce analysis is not completely neglected recently. I've seen some EHE districts jurisdictions map out their local workforce or try to for their EHE plan and effort, and I think that's really good. And I've seen attention to local fields enumeration. I see it really as a result of recent attention to implementation science frames. Again, I think that's a good development. And I think also social structure, again, focus on social structure and implementation are highly warranted and needed in HIV prevention. So now I'm just going to walk through some observations about PrEP and PEP support, not PEP, just PrEP and PrEP support to help move forward this imagery I'm talking about in terms of critical social action fields analysis. And that was just a word cloud of HIV prevention I pulled from the internet. So, you know, in 2013, Deering called for planning for the epidemic response with PrEP within the knowledge base known as the diffusion of innovation. And in 2009, before FDA approval, Rosengarten and Michael also pointed the need for foundational planning. They conducted interviews with PrEP scientists, stakeholders about their expectations for PrEP, and most of these saw PrEP as a single sort of stable product. And so these authors, Rosengarten and Michael, concluded that they called for a refocusing of trials, not similar to the rationale that seems to be guiding calls for implementation science today, of broadening the academic mindset somewhat from the exclusive emphasis on efficacy studies to more broadly generalizable effectiveness trials and studies. And I would support that 100%. These two papers raise an important question for HIV prevention. To what extent was knowledge of the social field of HIV prevention and its relation to other social organizational institutions and sociocultural fields brought to bear in planning for US prevention with PrEP from the outset of this the discovery of this biological intervention? Was there, so to speak, an overarching concern for the social body for this intervention? Although a system for implementation to result in population effectiveness with PrEP may not have been well planned, there's certainly been a lot of trying to figure it out and reach population coverage since. For example, Don Smith and colleagues estimated the US population size and unmet need for PrEP in the US. And you know, that kind of thing is really important, forming a denominator for the PrEP population. And I think they're actually looking at revising that estimate now based on some additional information, which I look forward to. Here, this on the screen is a graphic from Pinto et al., including Rita Melendez in 2008 article called Improving PrEP Implementation Through Multi-Level Interventions. And I want to say, I refer people I'm working with on projects to this paper as an image as foundational for communicating about PrEP as a system in the United States. I give it to recipients, grantees, and others all the time and say, I need you to think about this and use this framework and be thinking about how, when you're going to teach about PrEP, how important this framework is. You know, although it looks a little mechanical or wooden to me, my thoughts really go beyond that when I look at this to the social action that would drive such a system, as well as create it in the first place. You know, I don't really see macro level sociocultural forces in this diagram or in this figure. However, you know, I assume them. I see interactions between the level as Nancy Krieger has pointed out, when the word social is used in a social ecological model, they're actually invoking social structure, and I would go so far to say is even an appreciation of what, not just social structure, but the process or the development of social structure. And I would go so far to say that it offers an appreciation of what Anthony Giddens has termed structuration, or the important observation that social structures are ongoing social accomplishments. We actually do social structure. We make social structure, we carry it, we create it, you know, collectively, and we don't all have equal power in that, but it is a social construct. And this is not mere constructivism. I'm not talking about critical theory here. I'm talking about power as being central to the organization of society and the importance of analysis for it. Here is a graphic that resides on a national website that I recently tweaked again. PrEP is more than a pill. Prevention with PrEP requires a comprehensive continuum of services and actions that any individual would need, thereby ensuring that PrEP is available, accessible, and acceptable. And PrEP has to be delivered, so to speak, by sociocultural systems. And there's a lot at stake at the top of this first box here to the left of planning, implementing strategies, programs, and services. Awareness is a weak term for what might be called sufficient knowledge base of the playing field and what might be sufficient knowledge base of the action of HIV prevention for a comprehensive continuum of PrEP. And that each continuum of PrEP has to be local. And awareness, there's also norms and influence that stand behind awareness, and awareness doesn't really, as a word, capture that. But these continua, because of the diversity of programs and services and resources in the United States, have to be local to catchment areas, and that's pretty complicated. Here's another graphic I recently tweaked, the collaborative model for PrEP. The graphic has always meant to illustrate the social system lens. In HIV prevention, prevention is a complex relationship between local communities, and communities needs a lot of unpacking, public health at all levels, as well as clinical behavioral and other social services. In the US, the situation really is, for HIV prevention, is really one of collaboration and services integration within the field of HIV prevention and in relation to other social and health system arenas of practice. It's a constant effort to leverage limited and siloed resources, both public and private. And it's constantly trying to insinuate things into complex, perhaps self-interested and focused, and therefore recalcitrant health and social systems. I want to point out later on, talk about Holtgrave and Baldessari as observers of HIV prevention in the United States. But by 2018 and 2019, I think Holtgrave and Baldessari both published a number of papers and were pretty clear that there was a need to turn to implementation science and structural interventions to really end the epidemic and to do high impact prevention in the United States. So I just want to appreciate, the growing emphasis again on implementation science and social structure in HIV prevention. PrEP institutes, this is another sort of thing that I've developed or worked on to try to spread PrEP in the United States. I've been trying to, this strategy is for local collaboration and service building and I call it PrEP institutes, but these are events that are meant to involve people in population catchment areas who have interest, social capital, and potential roles in prevention with PrEP. The participants are meant to share in and be subject to some local conditions. So, someone doing outreach on the street, needs to be able to refer a client to someone local. It's not going to help for them to develop a PrEP system with somebody in another state or another area where their client can't access services. So there's a need for highly focused determination of need, health planning, and highly specific collaboration and prevention strategy development in client catchment areas to help support continuity of needed services to the extent possible. And again, local needs and resources vary. Think about Medicaid expansion, no Medicaid expansion, maybe not very friendly clinics, and so on. So it's necessary to engage a rigorous needs assessment to support collaborative learning events and to help cobble together a working set of relationships and actions that would constitute a local continuum. And I'm going to talk a little bit about navigation because I've been supporting navigation as a subject matter expert for quite a while now too, with PrEP and ART navigation. And, I think one thing I like to point out is that navigation really is the glue to the extent that there is a comprehensive continuum of PrEP care in a jurisdiction or in a catchment area. There really isn't a safety net, and navigation means somebody who can guide to all of those. I don't know how a person could access a system. It's so complicated without such a guide. And so to the extent that there is a continuum, it's a glue held together by people who know how to navigate and guide in that system. So practical hands-on support and guiding individuals in need to and in the complexity of health and social services system or HIV services navigation has mostly been an unfunded ambition in HIV prevention. initiative for navigation bars from other health arenas. Particularly, it came from cancer care, and it made it first inroads variously into HIV prevention in the Ryan White edifice. I spent a lot of time studying the literature, looking for sort of the core elements or core practices to help communicate, navigation, what it is, leveraging resources. And this really is a lot of work that comes sort of at, I would say, at the intersection of chronicity with infectious disease control, and frontline staff embedded in communities really play a role in this integration in services. And often they're doing it with limited resources. This next slide is just something I used in a training ever since navigation was first mentioned in a NOFO funding in 2010. As I say, I've been trying to understand and bring the lessons across the field to bear in the workforce and trainings and communications. I recently gave a plenary presentation on new flagship funding for CBOs in the United States, where I think I used this in some of the other graphics, but this is just to convey that there's no single product of navigation, so programs need to build their own locally relevant program, drawing analysis of their local needs, resources, abilities, relationships to make it so. And this template for program services model is to assist them. So this is in addition to a navigation program development implementation planning tool that we also deploy. Next, I just want to point to, this is a job aid I made that I recently gave in a presentation for a course that should be available soon in the marketplace that I developed with Health HIV. Again, the safety net for PrEP in terms of covering the cost of clinical care is really complex, perhaps even convoluted. So again, I'm not so sure how somebody would figure it out on their own. Anyway, this is drawn from this covering the cost of PrEP course. It's a job aid used in the course. And I've worked with others to develop a number of PrEP courses. This course on covering the cost of PrEP is for a wide range of people who may need to help consumers with PrEP costs. And it was developed again with Health HIV. And you can see the job aid online. It's online now. And this is just a screenshot, just one of the parts of the job aid. And this one really relates to, there's 4 categories of clients, sort of those who have insurance, but this one is sort of the worst case scenario, those who have no insurance, can't afford insurance and can't pay out of pocket. It's just an example, and again, you could use this, but it just cobbling together the safety net, and I think there's changes afoot policy-wise with how PrEP coverage, but PrEP can be covered, but it's not easy. Anyway, that's just some. And then here's a conclusion that I drew that I think I had in that webinar for either I gave an internal presentation on navigation at the agency, but also for that new NOFO funding. And I added a bullet here. I added the bullet, the final bullet. I'm not sure that this last bullet would be comprehended in presentations where I was not able to illustrate the lens of social strategic action fields analysis as I'm striving to do today. But I mean, to develop and support navigation and actually all of HIV prevention requires a lot of program collaboration and services integration, integrated planning. And I mean, integrated planning, planning has real teeth in the Ryan White silo and the prevention silo, and its integration, it's growing, and it has to do with this issue of community and community input. And I think that we need to think a lot more about that. Program evaluation, I think we need to think more about that and how it's done and who does it and who has the capital and who's allowed. And in relationship to implementation science, descriptive studies, core components identification. I've done a lot of core components analysis and work and theorizing with others like Jennifer Galbraith. And recently I noticed in a national webinar, a program that was trying to develop all the core elements or core components of pro-health action that's possible from the literature in the United States. And this person actually, their job title was chief ontologist. And I really like that job title. And I wish I could get a job as chief ontologist, but I think we need to know more about, maybe instead of single products, what are the core elements of change? What are the social determinants of pro-health change? And what are the social determinants of mitigating negative health processes and structures and national natural structures. Implementation science, again, translation science, and again, this missing link of explication of strategic action in the field of HIV prevention. Here is associate, whoops, we go back one. Here's a graphic, going back, stop, the thing is moving, sorry. Sorry. This is a graphic from Mugavero. I'm sorry if I'm messing up the first name, et al. 2013, the stage of engagement of HIV care in the United States, that Pinto et al. Cited in their paper as inspiration for this socio-ecological model. Illustrated here is a complex of interactions of programs and services. I particularly like that these HHS agencies are represented in the field, as it really points to the large silos and need for program collaboration and services integration at the national level. So if you look at the far right there, you see this HHS agencies listed here on this. The resources, actions, and will to implement these practices, I would submit, may be more important and are more at stake than the further examination of these practices for knowledge of them as to their implementation in like single or clustered implementation settings. How are the resources, both material and social, mobilized or not? That to me is a key question, rather than how we implement some of these known practices in single or even clustered settings. Those may not answer the larger social environmental questions that could overarch those single implementations or even cluster implementations. It's not hard to see a social field barrier worth critical analysis where promising PrEP-related interventions may not even be adequately funded. And here I might point to C4 or HPTN 073. You know, that's not to cast aspersion there. I believe there are demo projects and other social capital at work in the field to help bring such an intervention to the field. But I sometimes wonder, is the rationalization of what is fundable practice itself doesn't warrant analysis. We're talking about big P and little p policy and program development, all of which are sociocultural. Do we need another randomized controlled trial of case management of individuals in primary care to sort of address the social determinants of health? Or are there not factors at meso level organizational and at larger macro level that we should also be attending to and that don't require randomized controlled trials? Anyway, maybe change only occurs from the bottom up, which is why we're cynical human beings, because sometimes I feel like we are trying to change just from the bottom up, just from the workforce. And it's hard to change from the top down. Or maybe this is all just a wicked problem and there's no answer to it. But the sociologist in me won't conclude that it's just a wicked problem. I think that there are it's a sociological problem and a political problem, and generally a social problem. Here is a clip of a graphic of Bronfenbrenner socio-ecological system theory cited by Pinto et al. And Mugavero et al. Also as inspiration for their models too. And it includes the macro level of systems, norms, values of cultures and subcultures, beliefs, systems, ideologies, societal structure, national and international resources. And I'm sorry if the capture's not too good there, but I want to point out that this macro system lens was missing and in the previous models. And although I do see it in the Pinto model and in the Mugavero model, I see it. I just think we need to be more explicit here. And Pinto et al. Found few or limited interventions to address stigma. And I wonder, is that a wonder when the sources of stigma may be macrostructural as well as much or more than it is something that operates at micro level or at meso levels or even in interpersonal interactions? Of course it operates there, but the fundamental sources of it may be larger and may be meso level, organizational level, and higher. And addressing stigma may have to occur at these structural levels, at this socio level of culture. I mean, we know that training doesn't actually reduce stigmatizing behavior of clinicians. So, you know, something more than individual level response is certainly needed. I'm going to hazard to say that the push to the paradigm of status neutral prevention is itself, or could be, a sociocultural project meant to impact stigma as much as it is a strategy for the delivery of services like to whole people, using preventive medicine and so on, and population health. I think critical analysis of actions to deploy the frame in the field of status neutral might be really good case to examine HIV prevention as a social field, like I'm claiming we need. And perhaps institutional entrepreneurship as a component of possible phenomenon change, and social fields analysis, including the role of institutional entrepreneurs, is really, really quite cutting edge in organizational studies today. And I would direct people to that literature. In fact, a lot of literature, I have reading lists for a lot of the large chunks of theory and literature that I'm going over here today, and I'd be happy to help with that if should you be interested. Just write me and I will. So I'm going to do a little bit about DEBI, and here again is my social fields action. Community fit. So Andrea, Dworkin et al. Systematic implementation and achievement of intended outcomes of a number of DEBIs show that when implementation resources were made available and utilized, there were favorable short-term outcomes. So, DEBI had its successes and there were a lot of supports for it, and there still are some, not as much as there were, but there was a lot going on behind the scenes, and I'm not sure people recognized or always took stock of. But they did show some efficacy, and I'm not going to get into efficacy versus effectiveness. It's an important construct, and it's certainly behind a lot of what I'm talking about here today. But I think the potential for effectiveness is still there and was still there, and certainly we're talking about generic, natural social processes. They happen every day in our lives, no matter what. Dworkin et al. 2018 in the paper cited at the top of that slide say that they critically reflect on the extent to which known principles of community collaboration have guided key processes associated with the DEBI rollout. These authors go on to argue that carefully evaluated participatory program development should be integral to scientific process. I agree completely. I think they're talking about the field and analyzing the larger context, and I think that's really important. As Dworkin et al. Also note, McElroy et al. 2006 developed a framework for the diffusion of evidence-based interventions that relates to the importance of social context in the field of HIV prevention for effective interventions. McElroy et al., drawing on Galbraith's dissertation, really provided a tool for the systematic assessment by end users of the fit of intervention possibilities to the environment intended, so that they could select an intervention or interventions for implementation. Their model also talked about adaptation at the intervention level itself. It was an expectation of their model. Their model did not talk about adaptation at the intervention level, but at the system level. But there were plenty of tools for formative evaluation developed by others to support intervention level adaptation. And in fact, I wrote one, I led the development of at least one guide just on the subject and on many for DEBI packages. So the DEBI edifice contained a different approach to the just do it single product inert view of DEBI packages, which may have held great strength in the positivistic environment of HIV prevention field standards of efficacy. It was a lot of back and forth in the field on the importance of the sociocultural context of DEBI implementation and strategies for sociocultural relevance. No, they never seemed to rule the day. It seemed to be that the single product view may have been ascendant, and that that's all rather complex and has things to do with, I think, viewpoints of epidemiology and other, sociology of science and so on that I'm not going to go on. But I do want to comment that I think Dworkin et al., and that includes Bob Remien here, ask an important question. What is the recognition of social complexity and strategies for social action? What does community mean, and how is it relevant or engaged or more tellingly supported to do what maybe only it can do, whatever it is? Knowing the principles of community collaboration is necessary, but may not be sufficient for making it so. And here I want to just point to well, sorry about this. My slides are slightly out of, but I'm just going to point to Holtgrave. It likes to jump around on me now. Holtgrave in 1995 talked about the field of HIV prevention and he's made, they've made really good observations. I think he's been in a strong position to make recommendations about the field of HIV prevention, both him and Baldassari. They commented that a shift is occurring towards more comprehensive community participation and shared decision-making about HIV prevention efforts. Now, in 1995, this was about the time of the advent of HAART, and a highly active antiretroviral therapy. And following on the 1990 authorization of the Ryan White Care Act, these were developments that may have been affected by social activism. For example, the arrival of ART itself was likely influenced by social action, like the Treatment Action Group of New York City's ACT UP. And community input into clinical trials also became a strategy that likely yielded real benefits from the involvement of TAG and ACT UP and others in social movements in the United States. However, it appears that since the advent of ART in 1995, volunteerism in HIV prevention and in care fell off appreciably. We get some discussion of community-based participatory research today. It gets some traction. There's not a lot of volunteerism in general in America and in HIV prevention. We need to think more about this. Recently, I've heard about people at the NIH and borrowing from cancer and developing a field they call engagement science, following on from cancer studies. And Rita, I don't know if you've looked at that literature on engagement science, but it's a pretty interesting idea and development in the domain of science here of HIV prevention and health promotion. And I think core elements, again, I want to allude to core elements as an important element in HIV prevention. And I was thinking about, these generic social processes, natural social processes, and how we might support them. So on to a little bit about DEBI. Well, actually, I think I covered Dworkin and McElroy, and so I need to move on to opinion leaders. So Kelly in 1990 and colleagues published a paper on an intervention to spread the social norm of condom acceptability and use outside the urban gay enclaves of the United States. And he did so based on observations, I guess, of the role of opinion leaders described in the Diffusion of Innovation Science, and perhaps from observations of the condom code that had emerged among gay men in US epicenters in the 80s. A response of them, the men themselves, the social movement in these networks, perhaps to how to make love in the context of the epidemic. And I'm thinking about, Greenwich Village, the Castro, Boys Town, West Hollywood, and so on. Kelly apparently replicated the phenomenon in non-metro cities of the US. It was packaged and funded, and other resources were made available for implementation. Clearly, social influence matters to social network uptake of a prevention strategy. It seems to me that strong social fields analysis, like identification of naturally occurring opinion leaders, is necessary to spread pro-health strategies. Indeed, the packages, all the DEBI packages that do it, call for it, but how astute are we at it? Will a single implementation study do the trick? Might the strategy be better to strive to identify and support naturally occurring pro-health influence and thereby maybe deflate negative trends? That's a possibility, isn't it? Does science have to rationalize it in order to fund it, to do the prevention? Could we fund the core elements, think about where they apply and fund them where it's already happening, or support what's already happening and deflate what's not? Can you monitor the field for influence and help spur it on? It's happening today all the time on the internet. We're not strangers to social influence and social networks and how opinions and knowledge and what counts for facts spreads in social life. And we weren't that blind to it before as social beings. The need for safe spaces amongst those experiencing great disparities in health outcomes has really made it again into recent funding for community-based HIV prevention. Yet I want to ask, how many times does the importance of supportive social networks and resources like home territory and self-determination need to be discovered to truly be supported? The social principles are known. I would say 2 of the best, strongest PrEP programs I know in the US are driven by and for men of color and organizations that have historically received strong empowerment funding. I mean, there's something to be said for addressing local social conditions if you're able to institute a safe space, a community space, a self-determined space run by peers, for peers, where others get out of the way and trust them. It's not cheap. A minimum of 2.5 FTEs might be needed. A 24/7 controllable, self-control, accessible, acceptable space, materials and resources for the space, the network and the influence to develop the network, the materials and resources. Some entity has to administer the dollars and stay out of the way. So it requires a lot of trust to allow youth to determine things for themselves. So I just want to raise it, so how do we engineer natural social processes? Do we know enough about the field and how social action works and how social structure comes about and what it is? I had a whole section here on social determinants of health that I'm not going to cover, but I think there's some next steps in the social determinants of health framework that public health needs to engage. And I have a bibliography or a reading list featuring Nancy Krieger and others on that subject that I could share. I just want to say, think about, how these things exist and how they work and how they're negotiated by relations of power in the field of HIV prevention, and it's embedded in other fields, social action fields, and that's important too, because catastrophic things like COVID can have a big change on the field and other fields in which it's embedded, and so on. So in conclusion, I just want to say HIV prevention is a social action field. It's a missing unit of analysis in prevention policy and planning, and in the somewhat newly rationalized domain of implementation science. We may not be looking strongly enough at macro level social structure to the neglect of social and cultural facts like stratification and norms, and examining downstream meso-level systems, interpersonal interactions, and individual interpsychic orientations. The analysis I'm advocating for would use criticality of social power or interest as a key frame or teleology for the analysis. And we may need such analysis and focus to support pro-health social action to end the epidemic in the United States. And thank you. I'm sorry for being so long-winded, and I hope I didn't go too fast. And thank you.
Thanks so much, David. We have a question from Brian Kuttner. Brian, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome, thanks. These are excellent talks. I have actually kind of a more of a career question than a specific question about the research at this point. And part of that is actually because I think Rita, if Rita's still here, I took a seminar with you in undergrad with Joshua Gamson on sexual diversity and social change. And I was just wondering, like, that was a very influential experience to have. And I'm wondering, since the fellowship, if there have been anything that sort of like has surprised you about the direction that your careers have taken in terms of the lines of research that you've pursued, or is it something that you sort of kind of always thought back then you would pursue these lines of research that you have been pursuing?
Want to answer first, David?
Please.
It's nice to remember Gamson seminar. That was a long time ago, so thanks for reminding me about that. Thinking back to grad school, like, sexuality studies was kind of like new. It was sort of interesting. It was like to have a class in like something relating to sexuality was so like unique. And then, it kind of like led me to I think do some research in grad school around this idea of coming out, and it me then to feminist theory, and I think to the HIV Center. I think since the HIV Center, since the fellowship, sort of been pursuing the same thing, almost like advocacy, right? Advocacy around sexuality studies and really seeing sexuality as area of study. But I think also sort of ideas of equity and sort of, promoting access to care among communities that don't have them. And I actually went to San Francisco State for both those reasons. Right? One was because I was going into sexuality studies department, and because the promise of being able to do research from San Francisco State University, which I grew up like 5 blocks from San Francisco State, and my sister went there, and there was this whole kind of like community that I wanted to kind of give back to the community that I knew and to this majority minority institution. So it led me to San Francisco State, and since there has kind of been a wild ride. I've similar experience because it depends kind of political situation, economic situations, and of course the sort of administration at the university.
So I think Rita's kind of frozen. Are we frozen? Are we good?
We're good. I just thought that was
okay. I guess I'll try to answer. I mean, I'm not really surprised. I was, since the beginning of the epidemic, I was trying to do applied work, and there is such a thing as applied sociology, believe it or not. There's some programs that offer certificate in it. And actually it wasn't as an undergraduate at Georgia State University before Stony Brook, and they had quite an interest in it. But, my biography really took me to sociology, and AIDS came along and made a big impact in my life. So, I think, I'm not surprised at the work that I'm doing. Research, I really was, and classically, I was more interested in sexuality studies and lesbian and gay studies and social movements and change, and more traditional sociology than, HIV, but HIV certainly made a big impact. And so I sort of put my way through school actually doing it. And so, I actually came to HIV Center, and they were focusing some on sexuality at the time and HIV prevention, and actually focusing on sexual scripting theory. And I had been mentored by John Gagnon and Bill Simon, and worked in that. And, I really liked doing sexuality research, although it's hard to build a career at the time. It was hard to build a career as an academic at that time, and lesbian and gay studies even was waning at that time. I still had a commitment to HIV prevention, and I still feel like I use my knowledge that I've developed from working in it to the beginning of the epidemic, as well as my knowledge of sociology, to make a difference. I mean, to apply my knowledge to even when describing sexuality or working on products, or even like developing guidelines, and the way that we talk about sexual negotiation or, risk and so on. So, I think the sociology and my interest in sexuality studies and other things have served me well. And I'm not really surprised at where I am. And so I don't know what more to say about that. It's important, it really, it's different. And I think I would like to spend some time before I retire. I'm going to retire soon, maybe writing about applied sociology and working in the field of HIV prevention for those who do it.
Thank you. It's really helpful to hear both of your answers.
Thanks, Brian. We have time for one last question. This comes from No Kamagu Tuswa, and I apologize if I mispronounced that. David, don't you think the community clinics owe it to the community they serve for the availability of PrEP without a hassle of why? As it is, minorities have less awareness of PrEP, and those who are aware of it are not adherent at all and are lacking education.
Definitely. I think there's a number of strategies, and also think about these clinics on the front end and thinking about the field. Sometimes I wonder, if we're developing a plan and we're going to fund them, why do we fund clinics that are not accepting? Why don't we identify those clinics that are accepting, that are doing a good job, and focus on them? Are we really going to build out all clinics and make them culturally astute? That's a long haul problem. And I think that one reason we need navigation a lot, and people talk about navigation sort of as a response to the social determinants of health. I really think we need to, address upscale factors like the meso-level organization of these clinics and who gets funded and what they're allowed to do. More so than, depending on an individual to guide people in a social work case management kind of way, although they are essential at this point. And it is so complicated, and I think we are going to need it. So, I think, anyway, I think, some planning on the front end is really important, thinking about the field, what's needing and how change really occurs and what's acceptable, appropriate. Right now that it's just a safety net and that may change soon. We may get a true safety net for PrEP. I mean, you can get the drug-free from Ready, Set, PrEP, but the services and all, there's a lot of complicated leveraging of 340B and so on to pay for services. And it's really complicated. And I don't know how any individual would know without an expert guide to help them, someone with no resources and knowledge. We need a lot more, and I think influence as well as knowledge to be spread. There are some important indigenous or natural occurring things that I've seen, but I don't know why we're not seeing more of it and not funding more of it.
Thanks, David. And thank you both, David and Rita, for your presentations today and for joining us. Our time here is coming to a close. So Bob, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Rita. Thank you, David. It's heartwarming and really nice to have former fellows come back and to see what great careers you all are having, and we have more former fellows coming to us in the new year. So stay tuned for that. And what can I say? Happy holidays to everyone, and be safe. I know it's anxious times and stressful times, and Omicron, etc. So everyone, be protected, be safe. We hope you get to have some time with family and friends. So wishing everyone happy, healthy New Year. And we look forward to seeing you back here on Rounds on January 6th. Take care. And thank you for being here today. And thank you, Rita and David. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob, and everyone else.
Be well.
Go back to sleep, Rita.
Bye. Thank you. What'd you say, dear?
I said, go back to sleep.
Yeah, you're in early time zone.
The sun's come up. That's good.
Okay.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.